The silence was the first thing that hit him. It was a dense, unnatural quiet, the kind that presses in on your eardrums and makes the blood hum in your veins. Liam stood in the doorway of the house they had built together, a house that had, until this afternoon, been filled with the constant, low-level thrum of Isabel's life, her music, her chatter, the clink of her jewelry as she moved. Now there was only the sound of his own breathing, too loud in the sudden vacuum. The air itself felt wrong, stripped of her signature scent, that expensive blend of vanilla and something floral he could never name but could always find in a crowded room. It was gone. In its place was the sterile, chemical smell of cleaning products, sharp and alien. He walked slowly into the living room, his work boots leaving dusty footprints on the obsessively polished hardwood floors. His eyes scanned the space, cataloguing the absences. The stack of glossy magazines from the coffee table, gone. The throw blanket she loved, the one that was the color of a sunset, gone. The silver-framed photos of her with her friends, gone. It was a selective erasure, a surgical removal of her presence. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a premonition that was more certainty than fear. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. This is where one such story began, in the echoing quiet of a home that had just become a house. On the kitchen island, a space usually cluttered with mail and Isabel's car keys, sat a single, pristine, white envelope. Next to it, catching the late afternoon sun in a cruel, glittering wink, was her engagement ring. Not the diamond he had spent 2 years saving for, the one he'd presented on a windswept cliffside, but the simple gold band he had given her on their first anniversary of living together. It was a precise, calculated cruelty. This was not a moment of passion. It was a premeditated amputation. His hands, rough and calloused from a decade of construction work, felt clumsy as he picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, not their usual stationery. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Inside, the note was short, written in her perfect looping cursive that had always seemed at odds with her restless energy. "Liam," it began with a chilling formality. "I'm sorry to do this, but I can't live this life anymore. Julian offers me a world you can't. I need more than just this." The word "this" was underlined, a dismissive flick of the pen that encompassed their home, their life, their last 5 years. "He's not just a friend, Liam. I'm sure you figured that out. Please don't make this difficult. I've taken my things. The rest is yours." And then, the final devastating blow, a postscript scrawled at the bottom as if it were an afterthought, a grocery list item. "Chloe's school called. She got into another fight. You'll have to handle it. Her things are in her room. I couldn't. It's better this way. Chloe," his 17-year-old sister. He had become her legal guardian after their parents' accident 2 years ago. It was a role he had taken on without hesitation, a heavy mantle of responsibility that Isabel had always treated with a kind of detached annoyance, as if Chloe were a stray cat he had brought in from the rain. Now Isabel had not only abandoned him, but she had also abandoned the troubled, grieving girl who had just started to see their house as a home. The weight of it, the sheer, crushing scale of the betrayal, buckled his knees. He sank onto one of the bar stools, the letter trembling in his hand, the silence of the house now roaring in his ears. He remembered the rehearsal dinner just 2 weeks ago, the clinking glasses, the low murmur of happy voices. He had felt a surge of pride, looking at Isabel across the table, radiant in a silk dress, laughing with her friends. Julian, her boss, the charismatic, silver-haired owner of a development firm, had been there. "He's just a friend, Liam," she'd said 100 times, her eyes wide and innocent, a slight irritation in her voice that he dared to question her. "He's my mentor. You should be happy for me." And he had been. He had wanted to be. But there was something in the way Julian's hand lingered on the small of her back, the way they shared a private smile when they thought no one was looking. A week before the dinner, a gnawing suspicion had led him to a small and desperate act. He had a side job installing a new security system at the restaurant Julian owned, the one where Isabel often had late meetings. Fueled by a sick feeling he couldn't shake, he had reviewed the footage from the private back office. He had told himself he was being paranoid, crazy. He had expected to find nothing, to feel ashamed of his own mistrust. Instead, he had found them. He had watched on a grainy monitor as the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 weeks melted into her boss's arms. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was a long, slow, possessive embrace, followed by a kiss that left no room for interpretation. He had watched them for 10 minutes, his world quietly imploding in the sterile quiet of the security office. He had confronted her, not with anger, but with a hollow, dead feeling inside him. He showed her a still image on his phone. She had cried. She had sworn it was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness fueled by too much wine and the stress of the wedding. "He's just a friend," she had sobbed, the words now a toxic refrain in his memory. "He was comforting me. It meant nothing, Liam. You and me, we are everything." He, the builder, the fixer of all things broken, had chosen to believe her. He had chosen to patch the crack in their foundation, to plaster over the rot, because the thought of demolition was too terrifying to contemplate. At the rehearsal dinner, sitting with that poisonous knowledge coiled in his stomach, he had made a choice. During the toasts, when her father handed him the microphone, he walked not to the center of the room, but to the large projector screen the restaurant used for corporate events. He didn't say a word. He just plugged his phone into the HDMI cable, and he played the video, the entire 10-minute clip from the back office. The room had fallen into a silence that was 1,000 times louder than the one in his house now. He remembered the collective gasp, the frozen, horrified faces of their friends and family. He remembered the look on Isabel's face, a rictus of shock and fury, her beautiful mask crumbling to reveal the ugly truth beneath. He had dropped the microphone, its feedback a piercing shriek that echoed his own internal scream, and walked out. He thought that had been the end, the final, spectacular implosion. He thought that act of public immolation was his rock bottom. He was wrong. That was just the demolition. This, sitting in the silent house with the note in his hand and the knowledge that his teenage sister was now solely his responsibility, this was the wreckage. This was the rubble he was now expected to live in. The weight of the silence, the weight of the empty rooms, the weight of Chloe upstairs, all of it pressed down on him. He wasn't just abandoned, he was buried. The first few weeks were a blur of mechanical motion. Liam operated on a primal kind of autopilot, a ghost haunting the hollowed-out shell of his own life. His physical world shrank to a grim, repeating triangle, the chaotic job site, the sterile fluorescent aisles of the grocery store, and the suffocatingly quiet house. He moved through these spaces like a somnambulist, his eyes seeing but not registering, his body performing tasks his mind had no part in. At work, the familiar heft of a hammer or the roar of a circular saw were small, temporary anchors in a sea of numb disorientation. He would drive nails with a furious, mindless rhythm, the percussive impacts a crude substitute for the words he couldn't form, the anger he couldn't feel. His boss, a gruff, sun-weathered man named Mr. Thompson, watched him with a wary eye but said nothing, a silent clemency Liam was too broken to be grateful for. The house was the worst. It had become a hostile environment, a museum of his failure. Every corner held a memory that ambushed him. The indentation on the sofa where Isabel used to curl up, the single, forgotten earring he found under the bed, the half-empty bottle of her shampoo in the shower. He tried to purge the place of her, stuffing her remaining belongings into black trash bags with a cold, methodical fury. But her ghost lingered, a faint, mocking perfume clinging to the curtains, a phantom echo of her laughter in the dead air. The home he had once taken such pride in, with its custom-built shelves and perfectly mitered joints, now felt like a tomb. Dust gathered in the corners. Mail piled up, unopened, a stack of demands from a world he no longer felt part of. Chloe's presence was a constant, silent accusation. She drifted through the house like a wraith, all sharp angles and sullen silence. Her bedroom door was a permanent barrier between them. He would leave plates of food outside it, offerings to a resentful deity, and find them hours later, cold and untouched. He heard her crying sometimes, thin, ragged sobs that cut through the walls and twisted in his gut like a dull knife. He knew he should talk to her, should offer some kind of comfort or guidance, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. What could he possibly say? He, who had failed to hold his own life together, was supposed to be the bedrock for this broken girl. He was a ruin, and she was trapped in the rubble with him. His exhaustion was a physical entity, a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. He slept in fits and starts, plagued by dreams of falling, of foundations crumbling beneath his feet. He'd wake up with his heart pounding, the sheets twisted around him, the silence of the house rushing in to mock his terror. The breaking point, when it came, was not a grand explosion, but a small, pathetic collapse. It was a Tuesday evening after a grueling 14-hour shift in the biting November rain. He had stopped at the grocery store, a place he now navigated with the grim efficiency of a soldier in a minefield, grabbing only the essentials. He was tired. Not just tired, but a deep, bone-marrow exhaustion that felt permanent. As he fumbled with his keys at the front door, juggling the two overstuffed paper bags, the bottom of one bag, weakened by the relentless drizzle, gave way. The sound was almost comical, a soft, wet tear followed by a cascade of mundane tragedy. A carton of milk exploded on the concrete porch, sending a spray of white across his muddy boots. A dozen eggs, his and Chloe's breakfast for the next week, splattered into a yellow, slimy mess. A jar of pasta sauce rolled away and shattered against the brick steps with a dull, final pop. He just stood there, staring at the wreckage, the spilled milk, the broken eggs, the spreading red stain that looked disturbingly like blood in the dim porch light. It was the final straw, the one insignificant, meaningless failure that his overburdened psyche could not absorb. It wasn't about the groceries. It was about everything. It was the empty house, the damning note, the silent, accusing sister, the pitying looks at work, the endless, grinding weight of it all. A sound tore itself from his throat, a raw, guttural noise that was half sob, half scream. It was the sound of a structure finally giving way, of support beams snapping, of a man utterly and completely broken. He slid down the wall, heedless of the cold and the wet, and landed in a heap on the porch, surrounded by the ruins of his dinner. He buried his face in his hands, the rough texture of his palms scraping against his skin, and for the first time since he'd found the note, he wept. Not silent, dignified tears, but ugly, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame, a storm of grief and rage and despair that he had held back for weeks. He was at the bottom of the trench, covered in mud and milk and failure, with no light in sight. The sound of the front door creaking open barely registered through the storm of his own grief. He felt a tentative hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his vision blurred by tears, to see Chloe standing over him. Her face, usually a mask of sullen indifference, was filled with a raw, uncertain alarm. She wasn't looking at him with pity or anger. She was looking at him with fear. In that moment, seeing his own despair reflected in her terrified eyes, something shifted. He was her guardian. He was the adult. He was all she had. And he was falling apart on the front porch over a bag of spilled groceries. That fear in her eyes was the catalyst. It was a bucket of ice water to his soul. It was the sight of the one person who depended on him entirely, watching him drown. He couldn't do this to her. He couldn't let Isabel's poison seep into the foundations of this girl's life too. He had to stop sinking. Right here. Right now. He took a shuddering breath, the cold, damp air stinging his lungs, and made a decision. It wasn't a grand, heroic vow. It was a simple, brutal, and necessary choice. He would not break. He would not be the victim in this story. He would stop digging his own grave and start climbing out of it. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching, his spirit bruised, but not, he realized, extinguished. He looked at Chloe, at the mess on the porch, and then at the dark, silent house behind them. "Go inside," he said, his voice raw but steady. "I'll clean this up." That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he worked. He cleaned the porch with a meticulousness bordering on obsession. Then he moved inside. He scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen that had been dripping for a month. With every task completed, he felt a small piece of himself clicking back into place. It was a language he understood. Identify the problem, find the right tools, and fix it. His life was the ultimate broken-down project. At dawn, exhausted but with a new, unfamiliar clarity, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. He made a list. At the top, in block letters, he wrote, "The first step." The first step was a sacrifice. It had to be. To build something new, you first needed capital, and he had none. His savings were gone, drained by wedding deposits he would never get back. His credit was a looming disaster of shared bills, now solely his. He walked into the garage, a space that had always been his sanctuary. Against the far wall, under a dusty tarp, was his grandfather's old woodworking lathe. It was a magnificent piece of machinery, a solid iron beast from an era when things were built to last forever. His grandfather had taught him on this lathe. The smell of sawdust and machine oil was the scent of his happiest childhood memories. It was his most treasured possession, the one thing he had planned to pass down to his own son one day. He ran his hand over the cold, familiar iron, a lump forming in his throat. Then he took out his phone, snapped a few pictures, and posted it for sale online. The pain of it was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a surgical pain. It was the cost of starting over. Within a week, the lathe was gone, and in its place was a small stack of cash that felt both substantial and pitifully inadequate. He used half of it to prepay 3 months of night classes at the local community college for a construction management certificate. He used the other half to hire a tutor for Chloe, whose grades had plummeted. The rest went to stocking the pantry with something other than instant noodles. It was a small beginning, a single course of bricks laid on a barren patch of ground. His new routine was brutal. Up at 4 in the morning for his shift, inhaling dust and diesel fumes all day, then straight to the college where he'd fight to keep his eyes open while professors droned on about OSHA regulations and materials procurement. He'd get home after 10, eat a cold dinner, and study until his eyes burned. He saw Chloe for maybe an hour a day, a passing exchange of tired greetings. But something had changed between them. The plates he left by her door were now empty when he returned. Sometimes he'd find a fresh pot of coffee waiting for him when he stumbled out of the house in the pre-dawn darkness. They weren't talking, not really, but they were communicating. They were two shipwreck survivors, clinging to the same piece of driftwood, paddling in the same direction. It was during this period that Ava came into focus. She had been a peripheral figure before, a name on blueprints, a sharp-suited presence at site meetings. Ava Chen, the architect. She was all crisp lines and cool efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes missing nothing. To the crew, she was an intimidating, almost alien presence, someone from the world of clean lines and theory who didn't understand the mud and sweat of reality. Liam had initially shared this view. He saw her as an obstacle, the source of frustrating change orders and impossible design flourishes. Their first real interaction was an argument. She had specified a particular type of imported Italian tile for a high-end bathroom renovation, a tile he knew was notoriously brittle and prone to cracking during installation. "The specs are the specs, Mr. O'Connell," she had said, her voice clipped, not even looking up from her clipboard. "I'm sure a man of your experience can handle it." "It's not about handling it, Miss Chen," he'd retorted, his patience worn thin by a long day. "It's about doing it right. This tile will look great for the photo shoot, but in 6 months your client's going to have hairline fractures all over their $1,000-a-foot floor. There's a domestic porcelain that looks identical, is 1/10 of the price, and is 10 times more durable." She had finally looked at him then, really looked at him, her sharp, intelligent eyes assessing him for the first time. She didn't argue, she didn't dismiss him. She just said, "Show me." He had spent the next hour after his shift walking her through the supplier's catalogue, explaining the technical differences in density and firing temperatures. She listened intently, asking sharp, insightful questions. The next day, a revised spec sheet appeared on site. The Italian tile was gone. The durable porcelain was in. It was a small victory, but it was more than that. It was the first time someone in that other world, Isabel's world of suits and titles, had not only listened to him, but had respected his expertise. Ava didn't offer him pity or condescension. She offered him a professional courtesy that felt, in his shattered state, like a lifeline. She saw his competence, the hidden framework of knowledge beneath the dusty work clothes. A new, unexpected ally had just been introduced to the blueprints of his life. The next 5 years were a montage written in grit and exhaustion. Time did not so much pass for Liam as it was conquered, one grueling day at a time. The seasons blurred into a cycle of pre-dawn darkness and late-night study sessions, the scent of sawdust and wet concrete replaced by the smell of stale coffee and old paper. The world outside his relentless routine of work and school seemed distant, a television playing in another room. He watched from the sidelines as trends came and went, as the city skyline shifted and grew. His own world was one of stark, narrow focus. He became a master of efficiency, a human machine calibrated for maximum output. Lunch breaks were spent in his truck, not eating, but hunched over textbooks on structural engineering and contract law, his highlighter bleeding yellow streaks across the pages. The calluses on his hands softened, replaced by the faint indentation of a pen, a new kind of stigmata marking his slow, painful transformation. He traded the raw physical labor of swinging a hammer for the cerebral strain of managing crews and budgets. He learned the language of architects and engineers, of subcontractors and city inspectors. He learned that true power on a job site wasn't about the strength of your back, but the precision of your planning. Mr. Thompson, his old boss, watched this transformation with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. The gruff old-school contractor saw Liam poring over blueprints one afternoon, making notes in the margins. "Think you're better than the rest of us now, O'Connell," he'd grumbled, a cigarillo clenched in his teeth. "Think a piece of paper from that community college makes you an expert?" "No, sir," Liam had replied, not looking up. "I think knowing why this support beam is overspec'd for the load it's carrying can save you $30,000 on this project alone." He slid the blueprint and a page of his own calculations across the dusty hood of the truck. Thompson had stared at it, his eyes narrowing, then spent 10 minutes with his own calculator. He never questioned Liam's studies again. A year later, he made Liam a foreman. 2 years after that, with Liam's management certificate framed and hanging in the site office, Thompson made him a junior partner, changing the sign on the side of his battered Ford F-150 from Thompson Construction to Thompson and O'Connell. His personal life underwent a quieter but no less profound transformation. The house, once a tomb, slowly began to breathe again. He and Chloe found a new rhythm, a quiet partnership built on shared responsibility and unspoken understanding. She took over the cooking, leaving him hot meals that tasted of forgiveness. He helped her with her calculus homework, the abstract logic of equations, a welcome respite from the messy variables of human emotion. He attended her parent-teacher conferences, sitting awkwardly in the small chairs, a giant in a land of children, swelling with a fierce, protective pride as her teachers praised her resilience and her sharp mind. He watched her grow from a sullen, angry girl into a confident, whip-smart young woman who had his eyes and a will of her own. The day she was accepted into the State University's architecture program, he felt a joy so pure and profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had not just saved her from the wreckage, he had given her the tools to build her own future. His relationship with Ava evolved at a glacial, tectonic pace. It was a structure built not on grand romantic gestures, but on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect. Their courtship was conducted over drafting tables and dusty construction sites. Their love letters were change orders and revised floor plans. He learned the cadence of her footsteps, the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was deep in thought, the subtle shift in her expression when a design finally clicked into place. She, in turn, learned to read the quiet language of his competence, the way he could walk onto a chaotic site and instantly see the flaws, the inefficiencies, the hidden potential. Their first date was an impromptu trip to a salvage yard on a Saturday afternoon, a shared hunt for reclaimed timber for a project they were both passionate about. They spent hours sifting through dusty piles of wood, their hands grimy, their conversation easy and unforced. He told her about his grandfather's lathe, and for the first time he spoke of the pain of losing it without the shame. She listened, her gaze steady and compassionate, and in that moment he felt a connection deeper than any he had ever known with Isabel. It wasn't the fiery, consuming passion he had once mistaken for love. It was something quieter, stronger, more durable. It was the slow, steady curing of concrete, the patient joining of two essential support structures. One evening, a year into his partnership with Thompson, he found her waiting for him at the office long after everyone else had gone home. She had unrolled a set of blueprints on his desk. They weren't for a client, they were for a house. A beautiful, modern design of glass and wood and stone, perfectly situated on a plot of land overlooking a small lake he didn't recognize. "I saw the lot was for sale," she said, her voice soft. "I thought of you. I just started drawing." He looked at the plans, at the space for a workshop in the basement, at the large open kitchen, at the second-floor studio with a perfect northern exposure for an aspiring architect. He looked at her, at the hope and vulnerability in her eyes, and he finally understood. He was no longer the broken man living in the rubble of his past. He was a builder, and this was the blueprint for his future. He reached across the desk and took her hand, his newly smooth fingers lacing with hers. "Let's build it," he said. He became a different man. The stooped shoulders and haunted eyes of the abandoned fiancé were gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own worth. He still wore work boots, but now they were paired with tailored shirts and expensive watches. The grit was still there, but it was now an internal reserve, a core of tempered steel beneath a polished exterior. He was harder, more disciplined, more powerful. He had learned the bitter lesson Isabel had taught him. Kindness without strength is a liability. He was still a kind man, but his kindness was now protected by a formidable wall of strategic foresight. He had built an empire not of glittering superficialities, but of solid, tangible things. Buildings that scraped the sky, a company that was respected for its integrity, a life built on a foundation of hard work and unwavering loyalty. He was ready. He didn't know what he was ready for, but he felt it in his bones, a sense of coiled preparedness. He had rebuilt his world from the ground up, and this time he had designed it to withstand any storm. The ghost appeared on a crisp Tuesday morning in October, a time of year when the air held the clean, sharp scent of impending change. Liam was in his office, a corner suite on the 40th floor of a skyscraper his company had just completed. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic sweep of the city he had helped to reshape. He was reviewing the final budget reconciliation for the project, the dense columns of numbers a familiar, comforting litany, when his assistant, a young, unflappable woman named Sarah, buzzed him on the intercom.
"Mr. O'Connell," she said, her voice holding a rare note of uncertainty. "There's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment. She says it's a personal matter." "I don't have any personal matters on my schedule today, Sarah," Liam replied, his pen hovering over a line item. "Ask her to leave a message." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back, lower, more hesitant. "Sir, she says her name is Isabel. Isabel Dubois." Liam's pen froze. The name, a word he hadn't heard spoken aloud in his presence for almost 7 years, landed in the quiet of his office with the force of a physical blow. A cold wave washed over him, a phantom memory of a shattered milk carton and the taste of despair. He had spent years building walls, reinforcing his life against this very possibility, and yet the simple utterance of her name was enough to find the hairline cracks in his composure. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the way he had trained himself to do.
He stared out at the city, at the solid, unyielding structures of steel and concrete. His city, his empire. He was not the man he had been. "Send her in," he said, his voice a low, steady calm that surprised even himself. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning his back to the door. He wanted to see her first, to have the tactical advantage of observing her before she could observe him. He listened to the soft click of the door opening, the faint, hesitant sound of her footsteps on the plush carpet. He heard Sarah's professional murmur and the quiet click of the door closing, leaving them alone. He smelled her before he saw her. Not the expensive vanilla of her past life, but a cheaper, sharper floral scent, desperate and cloying. He turned around, slowly. The 7 years had not been kind. The radiant, effortless beauty he remembered was gone, replaced by a brittle, carefully constructed facade. Her hair was a shade too blonde, her makeup a fraction too thick, a desperate attempt to plaster over the fine lines of worry and disappointment that radiated from her eyes. She wore a dress that was trying to be expensive, but the fabric hung wrong, the cut slightly off. She was a cheap imitation of the woman she had once been. Her new life, the one she had chosen over him, had evidently imploded. He knew the broad strokes, of course. Julian's development firm had been a house of cards, built on fraudulent loans and shady investors. It had collapsed spectacularly about 2 years ago, taking him and his reputation with it. Liam had followed the news with a detached clinical interest, the way an engineer studies a catastrophic structural failure, looking for the initial point of stress, the fatal flaw in the design. Julian had fled the country, leaving a trail of bankruptcies and lawsuits in his wake. And Isabel apparently had been left behind in the debris. She stood in the middle of his vast office, looking small and out of place, her eyes wide, as she took in the expensive art, the custom mahogany desk, the commanding view. This was the world she had craved, the status she had killed their future for, and he was sitting in the middle of it without her. The irony was so thick he could taste it. "Liam," she breathed, her voice a practiced, fragile whisper. She took a tentative step forward, her hands clasped in front of her, as if in prayer. "You've done so well. I always knew you had it in you." It was her opening gambit, a transparent attempt to align herself with his success, to imply she was a silent, supportive partner in his journey. He did not move. He did not speak. He just watched her, his face an impassive mask. He had learned from Ava that in negotiations, the first person to speak often loses. He let the silence stretch, letting it become a weight, a pressure she had to bear. She faltered, her practiced smile flickering. I know I have no right to be here," she continued, her voice gaining a tearful, tremulous quality. It was a performance, a carefully rehearsed monologue of remorse. "But I had to see you. I've made such a mess of my life, Liam. I was a fool. I was a child. Julian, he was a monster. He used me. He ruined me." The tears started to well in her eyes, real or manufactured, it was impossible to tell. She was playing the victim, casting herself as a casualty in a man's world, hoping to appeal to the part of him that had once been the fixer, the protector. But that man was dead. He had died on a cold concrete porch, surrounded by spilled milk and broken eggs. The man standing before her now was an architect of a different sort, a man who understood that some structures are too compromised to be saved, that some rot is too deep to be plastered over. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering, cold and clear. He was not her savior. He was not her friend. He was a stranger in a well-tailored suit, and his silence was the most terrifying thing she had ever encountered. She had come here expecting a scene, anger, maybe even a flicker of the old affection. She had come prepared for a fight or a reconciliation. She was not prepared for this absolute, dismissive void. She was a ghost from a past he had already demolished, and he was looking right through her. When her performance of remorse failed to elicit a response, a flicker of her old, familiar frustration crossed Isabel's face. Pity had not worked. It was time to change tactics. She took a deep, steadying breath, the fragile victim persona melting away to reveal the harder, more calculating woman beneath. She straightened her posture, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance he remembered all too well.
"All right, Liam," she said, her voice losing its tearful tremor and taking on a sharp, metallic edge. "Maybe you don't want to help me for old time's sake. I can accept that. But we're still tied together, whether you like it or not." He raised a single, questioning eyebrow. but remained silent. Let her lay all her cards on the table. This company, she said, gesturing vaguely at the opulent office, the city spread out below them. Thompson and O'Connell, you started it while we were still legally married. I never signed any divorce papers, Liam. Did you forget that? He had not forgotten. In the chaotic aftermath of their split, he had been served with divorce papers from her high-priced lawyer, papers that demanded half of his non-existent assets and stipulated a crushing alimony. He couldn't afford to fight it, and he couldn't afford to agree to it. So, he had done nothing. The legal battle had faded into the background, another unresolved problem in a mountain of them.
He had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that she had moved on and let it drop. Now he saw the truth. It wasn't an oversight. It was a dormant weapon, a legal landmine she had left buried in his past, waiting for the right moment to detonate. I was your partner, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she laid out her attack. I supported you emotionally during those early years. I made a home for you. My emotional labor, my support, that was an investment in our future. A judge would see that. A judge would see that I am entitled to a significant portion of this business you built on the foundations of our life together. It was a desperate, ugly gambit, a perversion of the life they had shared, twisting memories of love and support into line items on a legal claim. She was trying to poison his success, to claim ownership of a structure she had abandoned before the first brick was laid. She was trying to blackmail him, using the ghost of their marriage as leverage. She was banking on the fact that he, the powerful Mr. O'Connell, would want to avoid a messy public divorce, that he would pay any price to make her go away quietly. She mistook his silence for weakness, his stillness for fear. It was the same mistake she had made 7 years ago. She had always underestimated his resolve, his capacity for strategic patience. He finally moved. He walked slowly, deliberately, from the window to his desk, the sound of his leather shoes a soft, measured beat on the carpet. He didn't look at her. He pressed the intercom button on his phone. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm and even, "please ask Mr. Davies to join us." A flicker of confusion, then alarm, crossed Isabel's face. "Who is Mr. Davies?" "My lawyer," Liam said simply, sitting down in his large leather chair. It was his throne, and from it he looked at her not with anger or hatred, but with a kind of detached pity. He was no longer a participant in this drama. He was a spectator. The door opened, and a trim man in a perfectly tailored grey suit entered. This was Michael Davies, a man whose legal mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel. He had been on retainer with Thompson and O'Connell for 3 years, a key part of the strategic wall Liam had been building around his life. Davies nodded curtly to Liam and then turned his cool, analytical gaze on Isabel. "Mr. Davies," Liam began, his voice the epitome of calm authority, "this is Isabel Dubois. She believes she has a legal claim to a portion of my company on the grounds that we are still legally married and that her emotional support during the early days of our relationship constitutes a foundational investment in the business." Davies listened without expression, then opened the leather briefcase he carried. He placed a single, slim file folder on the polished surface of Liam's desk.
"Isabel," Liam said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone. "You're right. We are still legally married. I haven't been able to finalize a divorce because, until this morning, I haven't been able to locate you. You've moved a dozen times in the last 2 years, always one step ahead of your creditors. But we've been looking," he gestured to the file. "You see, I've been preparing for this conversation for a very long time. I learned a valuable lesson from you 7 years ago. Always check the foundations. Always be prepared for the worst case scenario. This file is my worst case scenario preparation. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers, and the placid calm was gone, replaced by a glint of pure cold steel. You want to talk about foundational investments? Let's talk about them. When you left, you also left a mountain of shared debt. Credit cards, car loans.
All in both our names. I have receipts for every single penny I paid off. That's Exhibit A. Exhibit B is a full accounting of the assets you took from the home, far exceeding your share of our communal property. Exhibit C is a lovely little file on your partner, Julian. It details the fraudulent activities that you were, wittingly or not, a party to. Several of the investors he swindled would be very interested to know your current whereabouts. Isabel's face had gone pale, the carefully applied makeup standing out like a chalky mask. The fight was draining out of her, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. "But that's not the secret weapon, is it?" Liam continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "That's just the opening salvo, the real weapon." "Well, you gave that to me yourself." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He tossed it onto the desk, where it landed with a soft clatter next to the file. "You know," he mused, "it's amazing what you can find when you look hard enough. After you left, I had a little chat with the IT guy at Julian's firm. He was another one of the people Julian burned on his way out. For a small fee, he was more than happy to give me copies of the server backups, emails, text messages, all sorts of interesting conversations where you and Julian discussed in great detail how you were going to play me, how you saw me as a glorified handyman with a temporary cash flow problem, and how you were going to drain him dry on your way out the door." He let that sink in. The colour had completely drained from her face. She was looking at the USB drive as if it were a venomous snake. "So you can go to a judge," Liam said, leaning back in his chair, the picture of relaxed power. "You can file your claim, and we will respond. We will present my case, backed by years of meticulous documentation. We will detail your debts, your partner's fraud, and your own words in black and white, outlining your intent to commit financial fraud against me. And we will win. And then, Isabel, I will counter-sue you for that debt, for fraud and for legal fees. I will place liens on any asset you ever hope to acquire for the rest of your life. I will not just defeat you, I will erase you financially so completely that you will never be a threat to me or my family again." He stood up, the audience over. "Or," he said, his voice softening with a final, chilling note of finality, "Mr. Davies can draw up a simple agreement. You sign away any and all claims, past, present, and future, to my assets, my business, and my life. In return, this file and this USB drive remain in my possession, unused. You walk out of here, and I never see or hear from you again. The choice," he finished, walking back to the window and turning his back on her once more, "is yours, but I would advise you to choose wisely." The showdown was over. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lost his temper. He had simply unveiled the architecture of her destruction, a structure he had been quietly building for 7 years, waiting for this exact moment. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the empty, hollow silence of his abandoned home 7 years ago. It was the dense, heavy silence of utter defeat. He heard a rustling of paper, the scratch of a pen. He heard Michael Davies's calm, professional voice murmur a few final instructions. Then the soft click of the door as it opened and closed. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, looking out at the city, until he was sure she was gone. When he finally turned, Davies was standing by the desk, a single signed sheet of paper in his hand. The file and the USB drive were gone, safely back in his briefcase. "It's done, Liam," the lawyer said. "She's gone, for good." Liam nodded, a slow, single movement. He did not feel the triumphant elation he might have once imagined. There was no surge of adrenaline, no cold satisfaction. There was only a profound and sudden lightness. It was the feeling of a massive, unseen weight being lifted from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't even fully realized he was still carrying. The ghost that had haunted the periphery of his life for 7 years had finally been exorcised. The final piece of the old rotten foundation had been dug up and carted away. He was free. "Thank you, Michael," Liam said, his voice steady. "Send me your bill." Davies gave a rare, thin smile. Consider it a professional courtesy. It was a pleasure to watch a master craftsman at work. He nodded once more and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Liam alone in the quiet of his victory. But Liam didn't linger. He didn't pour a celebratory drink. He didn't call his partners to tell them the news. The victory was not the point. The point was what came after. He shrugged off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and grabbed his keys. His work for the day was done. It was time to go home. The drive home was a reversal of his 7-year journey. He drove away from the gleaming towers of his success, away from the world of contracts and power plays, back towards the life he had built from the wreckage. The house he and Ava had designed stood nestled among the trees, its warm lights glowing against the encroaching twilight. It wasn't a mansion. It was a home, built of wood and stone and love, every line and angle a testament to their shared vision. He walked in the door to the smell of roasting chicken and the sound of laughter. Chloe, home for the weekend from the university, was sitting at the massive kitchen island, her architectural sketches spread out before her. She was arguing good-naturedly with Ava about the structural integrity of a cantilevered balcony in her latest design. Ava, her face relaxed and happy, was wiping her hands on an apron, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked up as he came in, and her smile was all the welcome he would ever need. "Tough day?" she asked, her eyes searching his, always able to read the subtle shifts in his mood. He walked over to her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and buried his face in her hair. He inhaled her scent, a familiar, comforting mix of her own perfume and the smells of their home. "I just had to take out some old trash," he murmured against her neck. She understood immediately. She didn't need the details. She just held him tighter. "Well," she said, pulling back to look at him, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "It's gone now." Chloe looked up from her drawings, her young, intelligent face a perfect blend of his own determination and Ava's creative spark. "Everything okay, Liam?" He looked at her, at this incredible young woman he had raised, who was now designing a future of her own. He looked at Ava, his partner, his architect, the woman who had seen the man he could be when he was nothing but a ruin. He looked around the warm, vibrant kitchen at the heart of the home they had built together. This was his empire. Not the steel and glass downtown, not the numbers in a bank account. This. This was the structure that mattered. This was the thing he had built that would last. He smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "Everything is perfect," he said. He walked over to the large window that overlooked the lake, the last light of the day painting the water in hues of orange and purple. Ava came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Chloe joined them, leaning her head on his shoulder. The three of them stood there for a moment, a family forged in fire, and built on a foundation of loyalty and love, looking out at the future. "We have work to do tomorrow," Ava said softly, her words a familiar, comforting refrain that had bound them together for years. Liam squeezed her hand, his heart full. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with a profound and lasting peace. "We do."